Okay, this video is called Archimedes, the hero of Syracuse, of ancient Greece, and also how Archimedes and the Greeks fought the Romans. All right, so we first of all got to look at this map. And here is Syracuse. Syracuse was like a city-state, related to ancient Greece. Here is Athens, the great city Athens of ancient Greece. Okay, here is Rome, in Italy. All right, so Archimedes was from Syracuse. He had traveled around and seen a lot of what there was of the ancient Greek world. I'm going to show you some highlights from his life so it'll make sense. Here is where the king had asked him to figure out the volume of the crown and how much it weighed and the density and whatnot. And Archimedes was taking a bath. He wasn't sure how to figure it out, but he saw when he himself sat into the bath, it displaced the water upward, and that indicated how he could calculate the volume of it by measuring the displacement of the water. So he jumped out of the bath screaming, "Eureka, Eureka, I have found it. I have found the way to measure the volume." And here it is just showing it in a simpler sense. You've got a graduated meter here, and you can just put the screw in and you can see how much it displaces the water. That's the volume of the screw. Pretty simple. Okay, and he figured out lots of things. He basically invented the early form of calculus. Of course, Newton and Leibniz came along later and invented, advanced modern calculus, but he invented the early form of calculus. This is also called the Archimedes screw. It's a screw pump, and you turn the handle and you can lift the water, and that was used to irrigate lots of croplands and provide a lot of food. So Archimedes is one of the all-time great math geniuses of the ancient Greeks. The first one you'll hear about is Pythagoras and the Pythagorean theorem, and Pythagoras was the first vegetarian, and the vegetarian diet used to be called the Pythagorean diet. And then there's also Euclid's geometry. Plato was big at mathematics, and Plato's academy, everybody had to study mathematics. That was a requirement, okay? And then Archimedes was the greatest of all the ancient Greek mathematicians. And I'm going to show you some big stuff that he did. Okay, so now it's time for the big battle. Okay, we got to talk about what happened. So, of course, everybody knows the Punic Wars, and there was a lot of fighting between Carthage and ancient Rome. Okay, so here is Carthage in northern Africa, and they had a long-standing battle with ancient Rome. And as a matter of fact, Carthage had the great general Hannibal, who kicked the crap out of Rome. Okay? And that was like the worst defeats Rome had ever suffered. Hannibal is one of the all-time great generals, military geniuses. Okay? Syracuse had helped Carthage a little bit, and Rome was pissed off about that. And Rome felt it needed to put Syracuse in its place. Rome was a very dominant military power, in the ancient days. This map is like from 218 BC, just to give you an overall sense of the map. And then there is Athens, okay? Now, this is just a picture illustrating some of the things that Archimedes did. So Archimedes was from Syracuse, and he was put in charge of the defenses of Syracuse. He devised a claw system, like a grappling hook that could latch onto the Roman boats and tip them over. It was rather an incredible thing with his pulley systems. He devised a system of like crossbows to fire arrows at the Roman ships. He devised a system of mirrors. I'll show you it somewhere else, but it was rather incredible. He devised a system of catapults, and they were basically kicking the crap out of the Romans. Okay. This is just some more of the details of some of the inventions of Archimedes. A crossbow-like device, catapult devices, and a whole bunch of other things. Okay, there's just one more painting of Archimedes. The guy was a great math engineering genius of ancient Rome. He devised a system of mirrors, kind of like a primitive laser, to concentrate the sun's light, energy, and heat to burn the Roman boats. Okay, here's one painting of Archimedes, guiding the Syracusans to burn the Roman boats. And so there's the light reflected off the mirror. And, Syracuse was a university also in New York. Okay. Here's just showing a detail from the pulley system that was used in an elaborate way, set up that he could raise a boat, from the docks, or make his claw to hook the Roman boats. and then capsize them. Here's one artist's rendition of the Archimedean claw to destroy the Roman boats. And here's another more detailed artist rendition of the Archimedean claw grabbing a Roman boat, lifting it up into the air, and tipping it over. Okay. Okay, now I'm going to read you an excerpt from this book here. This is called The Cave and the Light by Arthur Herman. I've read tons of history of philosophy. This is the best one ever written. It's by far the best one ever written. And he's going to quote actually an ancient Greek historian named Polybius. So Polybius, this is his writing about Archimedes' defense of Syracuse. There was a new regional power in the central Mediterranean basin, the imperial republic to the north, Rome. Breaking Syracuse to its will was the key of Rome's hegemony over Sicily and the rest of Italy. And in 214 before Christ, an enormous Roman fleet and army gathered at the entrance to the harbor. Syracuse went to its battle stations, and its most famous citizen, Archimedes, now in his 70s, sprang into action. The best description of what happened next is by the Greek historian Polybius. He wrote it not long after the siege of Syracuse, when some of the participants may still have been alive. He tells of how the Syracusans put Archimedes in charge of constructing their defenses, and how he laid them out so that everything was ready at hand and could respond to any attack by the enemies with a counter move. The Romans were hardly amateurs when it came to besieging cities. Their plan was a simultaneous land and sea assault, with boats equipped with massive mobile siege towers, rowing up to storm Syracuse's walls. However, as Polybius relates, Archimedes had constructed artillery, which could cover a whole variety of ranges, so that while the attacking ships were still at a distance, he scored so many hits with his catapults and stone throwers that the Roman general Marcus Claudius Marcellus had to call off the attack before his men had reached the walls. On the landward side, the Romans fared no better. Their main objective was the eastern hexaply gate, but at every attempt to get scaling ladders and grappling hooks up the gate's walls, they met a hailstorm of fire from the catapults and the other war engines that Archimedes had devised. Stunned and exhausted, the Roman legionnaires finally had to retreat. The desperate Romans then tried a night attack, but Archimedes was waiting for them. As the Roman triremes glided up in the darkness, great wooden beams suddenly swung out from the walls of the harbor and hovered over the water. A range of catapult stones drove the Roman marines back from the bows of their ships, while grappling irons attached to the chain pulleys and dropped from the hovering wooden beams. At Archimedes' command, each engineer in charge of a beam then seized the prow of the ship, like an eagle or a hawk seizing its prey. When Archimedes' engineers were sure that they had a good grip, they pulled down on the lever controlling the beam's pulley. With a powerful jerk, each Roman ship was lifted up by its prow and made to stand on its stern. As the Romans on board jumped for their lives, the pulleys would suddenly be released. The result that some of the vessels keeled over and fell on their sides. Polybius relates, and others capsized, while still others hit the water so hard they began to flood and become useless to steer. All the same, a few intrepid Roman ships managed to get close enough to the walls to avoid the catapult barrage, and as the Roman troops made ready to jump ashore and begin their attack, it was a tragic mistake. Archimedes had carved out a series of loopholes along the city walls, and as the Romans scrambled for the shore, Syracusans opened up with scorpions, the ancient iron dart Gatling guns, another Archimedes' invention, which fired one after another devastating volley into the Roman ranks. The men screamed as they died under the deadly curtain of fire. The handful who reached the foot of the walls found themselves bombarded by rocks and beams thrown from above. Marcellus, realizing his attack had once again failed, sounded the retreat. Thanks to the efforts of a single old man, the Romans were beaten and demoralized. The Romans began to believe they were fighting a supernatural enemy, Polybius says, as they found themselves constantly struck down by opponents whom they could never see. Each time they tried to move their siege engines towards the walls, a volley of catapult arrows and stones greeted their advance. Each time their ships entered the harbor, the great grappling hooks swung down and scattered the mighty triremes as if they were toy boats. When they fell back to count their losses, Archimedes' machines continued to harass their retreat. According to Marcellus's biographer Plutarch, things had gotten so bad that each time the Romans saw a piece of timber or rope appear above the Syracuse walls, they would cry, "Look! Archimedes is aiming another one of his machines at us," and they would turn and run. Marcellus decided there was no way to take the city by storm. Archimedes uses my ships to ladle seawater, he grumbled to his officers. He decided that instead the Romans would wait it out and hope a blockade of the harbor could starve the Syracuse into submission. They did not have to wait long. Few ancient sieges ended by taking the city by force. Most ended with the besieged population starved into cannibalism and then submission or betrayed by one of their own, usually at night. The lock on a crucial gate left deliberately open, a party of enemy soldiers entering the side door in the walls, or a barred window open from inside in the dead of the night, a local prominent citizen who decides the enemy's victory will be his own opportunity for gaining power, and who bribes a guard to look the other way. That was how most ancient sieges ended, and so it happened with Syracuse. Marcellus noticed a particular tower which was carelessly guarded, perhaps deliberately, into which he could infiltrate his men unobserved. One night, as the Syracusans were celebrating a feast day in honor of the goddess Artemis, the Romans stormed the tower and burst into the city. Archimedes' triumph had been short-lived. Marcellus had wanted to spare the magnificent ancient city and to capture it intact. His men and officers, however, were hungry for loot and blood and had demanded their age-old right to plunder the captured city. Marcellus gave way. Although he wept at the thought of the Syracuse fate, according to Plutarch, and how its appearance would be transformed in a few hours as the soldiers plundered it. At one point, however, he was absolutely adamant. Take Archimedes alive. So the Roman legionnaires poured out into the Syracuse streets and looted and raped and murdered their way across the city. A handful of picked soldiers passed along the smoke-filled, blood-strewn alleys looking for Archimedes' house. They found it in a quiet corner and bounded up the steps. Archimedes had not heard the screams of his panicked fellow citizens. He was not even aware that the city that he had defended so skillfully had fallen to the enemy. He was sitting in a chair, absorbed in a geometric problem that he had drawn in a sand table on his desk. He did not even notice the Roman soldiers entering the room. A legionnaire stood behind Archimedes' chair and prodded him with a blood-stained sword. The old man looked up, startled and angry, and said, "Do not disturb my circles," he shouted. The soldier snapped. Perhaps he was exhausted from the terrible siege and carnage. Perhaps he was pumped from adrenaline from the sudden Roman victory. Perhaps he had seen too many of his friends and comrades killed by Archimedes' volleys of iron darts and thrown down and drowned by his great grappling hooks. Whatever the reason, a single lethal lunge, he killed the old man where he sat. When Marcellus heard the news that the Archimedes was dead, he bitterly regretted the passing of the man who, had he been taken alive, might have raised Roman siege warfare to a whole new level. He abhorred the man who had killed him as if he had committed an act of sacrilege. Plutarch tells us, and he sought out Archimedes' relatives and treated them with honor. Science had its first great hero, Martyr, and the power of technology to move and shape events was firmly fixed in the Western imagination. So that's the story of Archimedes from this great book, The Cave in the Light. I'll just show you a couple more pictures of this. So here is the stupid soldier who killed the great genius Archimedes. The Death of Archimedes by Thomas de George. And here is the painting by Raphael, The School of Athens in 1511. And you can see all kinds of the great ancient Greeks here. There's Plato pointing up to the skies, the perfect forms. He's standing next to Aristotle. So Aristotle's got a copy of the Nicomachean Ethics. He's got the Timaeus. Plato does. Aristotle's got the Nicomachean Ethics. He's a biologist. He points down to the ground. Be practical. Let's look at empiric evidence. There's Socrates debating something with Alcibiades. There's Heraclitus or Michelangelo. Diogenes, the great Greek philosopher. Okay. There's Euclid doing his geometry, and there's Archimedes doing his geometry. Okay, so it's a magnificent panorama of ancient Greek geniuses and scholars with a background in Roman architecture. It's beautiful, and Archimedes was honored here. And what I'm also getting at too is this is how you should teach engineering and mathematics to young students, to show them the power of it, how interesting it is, how useful it can be for all kinds of things. So anyways, I think that's the last slide. I hope you enjoyed that Archimedes, the hero of Syracuse, fighting the Romans.